Imagine a world celebrating the end of all wars. Church bells ring across cities, soldiers weep with joy on the streets, and peace treaties are signed with golden pens. But what if those same treaties were quietly planting the seeds for the deadliest conflict in human history? Welcome to our journey into the shadows of the 20th century. It is the summer of 1919. The location is the magnificent Palace of Versailles, just outside of Paris. World War I has finally ended. The victorious leaders gather in grand rooms filled with mirrors and crystal chandeliers. They want to ensure a global disaster like this never happens again. They draw new borders on maps with casual strokes of a pen. They create a heavy document to punish Germany, demanding massive financial payments. In historical English, we call these payments reparations. Listen for this word, reparations. It means making amends for a wrong, usually by paying money. But these reparations were impossibly high. They did not just demand money, they demanded national humiliation. This created a deep, bitter anger. We call this feeling resentment. Notice how we use the word resentment. It is not a sudden, loud flash of anger. It is a slow, quiet poison. It builds up over years in the dark. Think of human society like a physical body. When a body is rested and well-fed, its immune system easily fights off disease. But when a body is exhausted, starving, and stressed, a tiny infection can suddenly become fatal. In the 1920s and early 1930s, the global economy was that exhausted body. The disease waiting in the shadows was extremism. The first major shock was financial. Let us look at a strange, almost unbelievable scene in Germany in the year 1923. A young woman walks to the bakery to buy food for her family. She does not bring a wallet. Instead, she brings a wooden wheelbarrow piled high with heavy stacks of paper money. A single loaf of bread costs billions of marks. Factory workers are paid twice a day. They run to the stores during their lunch breaks because by the evening, the prices will double again. Children sit on the sidewalks, playing with bundles of cash like wooden building blocks. Families burn paper money in their stoves because it is cheaper than buying firewood. This economic disaster is called hyperinflation. Prices rise so violently that money loses all meaning. When money dies, a society's trust dies with it. And a society without trust is incredibly fragile. Then came the year 1929. The stock market crashed in the United States. The sickness spread across the ocean. Factories closed their doors. Millions of people lost their jobs. This era became known as the Great Depression. The global immune system collapsed entirely. Enter the infection. In desperate times, people look for strong voices. They want simple answers to highly complex problems. Listen for this essential term: fascism. Fascism is an extreme political system. Under fascism, the nation is considered far more important than any individual person. It is led by a dictator who crushes all opposition. The word itself comes from the Latin fasces, a bundle of wooden rods tied together. The message is clear. One stick is easily broken, but a tightly tied bundle is unbreakable. Fascism demands that everyone bind together, thinking the exact same way. The first major shift happened in Italy. A man named Benito Mussolini organized angry, jobless veterans into a private army. They wore black shirts. They marched on Rome, demanding power, and the king simply gave it to them. Mussolini promised order. He promised to restore the ancient glory of the Roman Empire. In neighboring Germany, another man was watching carefully. His name is Adolf Hitler. Hitler understood a terrifying truth about human psychology. If you speak to people's deepest fears, they will follow you anywhere. He used a very specific tool. In historical and modern English, we call this propaganda. Propaganda is information, often false or highly emotional, used to promote a political cause. Propaganda works like a distorted lens. It changes how you see reality. It makes citizens fear their innocent neighbors. It paints the world in simple black and white, us versus them. Hitler did not start with armies. He started with words. Through propaganda, he convinced millions of struggling Germans that they were victims. He pointed fingers at minorities, especially Jewish people, blaming them for the nation's economic ruin. This was a complete lie, but it was a lie told with absolute magnetic confidence. Here is a strange twist of history. Many people today believe dictators always seize power through sudden, violent revolutions. But Hitler did not. In 1933, he was appointed chancellor through legal, democratic channels. The democracy legally voted to end itself. Once in power, the grip tightened immediately. Books containing independent thought were thrown into massive bonfires. Political opponents vanished in the middle of the night. The state took total control over the radio, the newspapers, and the school classrooms. The biological virus of extremism had fully taken over the host. But how did the rest of the world react to this rising threat? They closed their eyes. The leaders of Britain and France remembered the muddy, bloody horrors of the First World War. They desperately wanted to avoid another. They chose a policy of giving the aggressive dictator what he wanted, hoping he would eventually be satisfied. This leads us to two urgent questions. What happens when a tyrant realizes that no one will stand in his way? And how far can one man push the entire world before it finally snaps? We have seen the sickness take hold in the mind. In our next part, the map of Europe begins to shatter, and the sweet illusion of peace is violently broken. A single piece of white paper fluttered in the autumn wind of 1938. The man holding it smiled warmly, believing this document was a shield against war. But history would soon reveal it was merely a blindfold. Let us step into this famous scene. It is September 1938. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain steps out of a silver airplane near London. A massive crowd waits for him, their faces pale with anxiety. Chamberlain raises a thin piece of paper high in the air. It is an agreement signed by Adolf Hitler himself. Chamberlain announces to the cheering crowd that he has secured peace for our time. The citizens of Britain and France breathe a collective sigh of relief. People dance in the streets. They believe the nightmare has been avoided. But this was a fatal illusion. To understand why, we must look at how an empire expands. Think again of our biological mirror. When a dangerous virus enters a human body, it tests the defenses. If the immune system does not attack, the virus quickly moves to conquer new, healthy cells. By the mid-1930s, Adolf Hitler was testing the world's immune system. In 1936, he ordered his army to march into the Rhineland, a region near France where German troops were strictly forbidden. His generals were terrified. They knew the French army could easily crush them. But France did nothing. Britain did nothing. The virus encountered no resistance. It realized it could spread freely. This brings us to a crucial concept. Listen for this word: appeasement. Appeasement means giving an aggressive person or nation what they want, hoping they will be satisfied and stop causing trouble. The leaders of Europe chose appeasement. They wanted peace so desperately that they compromised their own values to get it. A useful historical phrase to remember here is a false sense of security. When you have a false sense of security, you feel safe, but you are actually in great danger. By March 1938, Hitler moved again. German troops crossed the border into Austria. They did not fire a single shot. Hitler simply swallowed the country whole, adding it to his growing German empire. In historical English, we call this action to annex a territory. To annex means to formally and forcefully add land to your own country. The appetite of the dictator only grew. Next, Hitler demanded a large piece of Czechoslovakia. This was the crisis that brought Chamberlain to Munich in 1938. Britain and France, still practicing appeasement, agreed to let Germany take the land. They essentially sacrificed a small democratic nation to save themselves. The tragic twist of the appeasement strategy is that it almost never works. 6 months after signing that famous piece of paper, Hitler broke his promise. He ordered his armies to devour the rest of Czechoslovakia. The world finally understood a dark truth. A dictator's hunger is endless. The policy of appeasement was dead. Britain and France finally drew a line in the sand. They warned Germany that if it attacked its eastern neighbor, Poland, there would be war. On the crisp early morning of September 1st, 1939, the line was crossed. Imagine waking up to a sound you have never heard before. It is not the slow, muddy marching of World War I. It is the deafening roar of hundreds of airplane engines blocking out the rising sun. Bombs fall on airfields, destroying Polish airplanes before they can even take off. On the ground, massive steel tanks crash through border fences, racing forward at terrifying speeds. This was a completely new type of warfare. The Germans called it Blitzkrieg, which translates to lightning war. It was designed to create shock and extreme confusion. Instead of fighting slow battles in trenches, the military used speed and overwhelming force to break the enemy's mind before breaking their army. Despite fighting bravely, the Polish forces were crushed in a matter of weeks. The country was divided. The tragedy was compounded because, secretly, Germany had signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. The two massive dictatorships, one fascist and one communist, agreed to split Poland between them. The proud nation of Poland was suddenly erased from the map, plunged into a dark and brutal reality. This introduces one of our core historical concepts: occupation. Notice how we use this word. In historical English, military occupation is when a foreign army takes total control of a country, stripping the citizens of their laws, their freedom, and their safety. The occupation of Poland was exceptionally cruel, setting a grim standard for the years to follow. Britain and France had kept their promise. On September 3, 1939, they officially declared war on Germany. The Second World War in Europe had begun. Yet something very strange happened next. For the next 8 months, across the borders of France and Germany, almost no fighting occurred. Soldiers sat in the snow, watching each other through binoculars. The public called it the phony war. People began to wonder, was the war a mistake? Would the lightning stop? But the silence was merely the deep breath before the hurricane. When the storm finally turned toward Western Europe, how fast could a great world power fall? And while Europe watched its own borders, what fires were already burning violently on the other side of the globe? A thick, quiet forest lies on the border of France and Belgium. Military experts in 1940 called it completely impassable, a natural wall of dense trees and steep hills. But on a warm morning in May, the trees began to move. The silence of the European front was about to shatter, replacing the illusion of peace with the terrifying speed of modern war. For months, the French army had waited behind a massive defensive structure called the Maginot Line. This was a marvel of military engineering. It was a chain of underground fortresses made of thick concrete, equipped with heavy guns and subterranean train tunnels. The French generals expected a slow, grinding war, just like the trenches of the First World War. They believed their Great Wall would keep them safe. But the German generals looked at the map differently. They saw the weak point. They did not attack the concrete wall directly. Instead, they sent thousands of their fastest tanks squeezing through the narrow dirt roads of the Ardennes forest, the very place the French thought tanks could never go. Listen for this essential verb: to bypass. To bypass means to go around an obstacle completely, instead of fighting your way through it. The invading army bypassed the French defenses, bursting out of the forest and racing toward the ocean. Within a matter of weeks, the combined British and French armies were pushed all the way to the coast, trapped against the sea at a French town called Dunkirk. Imagine standing on a wide, sandy beach. Behind you, the smoke of an approaching enemy army darkens the sky. In front of you lies the cold, gray water of the English Channel. You are trapped. But then, a strange sight appears on the horizon. It is not just military navy ships coming down. It is hundreds of tiny civilian boats, fishing vessels, private yachts, and wooden ferries, sailed by ordinary citizens. They have crossed the dangerous waters under heavy enemy fire to save the soldiers. This brings us to a vital historical noun: evacuation. An evacuation is the highly organized movement of people away from an area of extreme danger. The evacuation at Dunkirk was a miracle of human resilience. Over 300,000 soldiers were rescued by those little ships. They lost their weapons, but they kept their lives. Despite this incredible rescue, the reality on the continent was grim. France, a massive global power, collapsed in just 6 weeks. German troops marched proudly down the streets of Paris. The country was divided, and half of it was placed under strict military occupation. The speed of this defeat stunned the entire globe. But our story is not just a European tragedy. To truly understand this war, we must turn our eyes away from the shadow of Paris and look across the world. Half a world away, a different fire was already burning violently on the other side of the globe. Let us travel to the massive continent of Asia. By the late 1930s, the island nation of Japan was rapidly expanding. Think of a growing industrial empire as a hungry, mechanical beast. To survive and grow, this beast needs raw materials: iron, rubber, and above all, oil. But Japan is an island with very few natural resources of its own. The Japanese military leaders, holding immense power over their government, decided that the only way to secure these resources was to take them from their neighbors by force. Long before the first bombs fell on Poland, Japan had already launched a massive invasion of China in 1937. This was the true beginning of the Second World War in Asia. The invasion was breathtaking in its brutality. When the Japanese army captured the Chinese capital city of Nanjing, the world witnessed a nightmare. We must learn a heavy English word to describe this: atrocity. An atrocity is an extremely cruel, shocking, and violent act, usually committed against unarmed people during a war. The violence against Chinese civilians remains one of history's darkest scars. Hundreds of thousands of innocent lives were destroyed, leaving a trauma that is still deeply felt today. News of these actions shocked the international community. Across the Pacific Ocean, the United States watched with growing alarm. America was not yet fighting in the war, but it wanted to stop Japanese expansion. The United States decided to use an economic weapon. Notice the term embargo. An embargo is a strict government order that stops trade with another country. In a decisive move, the United States placed an embargo on oil. They refused to sell a single drop of fuel to Japan. This created a desperate, ticking clock. A modern military cannot fly its airplanes or sail its battleships without oil. Suddenly, the Japanese war machine had fuel for only a few more months. They were suffocating. A nation pushed into a corner will often do the unthinkable. The Japanese leadership faced a brutal choice: abandon their empire and retreat from China, or strike out across the ocean to conquer new oil fields in Southeast Asia. But expanding south meant they would definitely trigger a war with the United States Navy. The pieces were now set on the global board. In Europe, Britain stood entirely alone. They waited in the dark, looking up at the sky, knowing thousands of German bomber planes were coming to break their spirit. In the Pacific, the Japanese Navy made its choice. A massive fleet of aircraft carriers vanished into the fog of the Northern Ocean, sailing entirely in secret toward a tropical island. Where would the fatal blow land first? And how does an ordinary citizen survive? And how does an ordinary citizen survive when fire falls from the clouds? The piercing wail of a mechanical siren cuts through the midnight air. Families do not run to their cars, they run down, deep into the dark, damp earth of the underground subway stations. It is the late summer of 1940. Britain stands entirely alone against the immense power of the German war machine. The physical ocean separates the British Isles from the strict military occupation of Europe, but the sky above offers no protection. Every night, the darkness brings a terrifying mechanical humming. Hundreds of enemy bombers fly over London and other major industrial cities. Buildings explode into bricks and dust. Entire streets catch fire. In English, we call this kind of attack an air raid. Listen to the phrase air raid. It is a sudden military attack from the sky meant to destroy infrastructure and spread panic. For months, British citizens lived through relentless air raids. This period became known as the Blitz. The German goal was deeply psychological. They wanted to destroy the nation's morale. Let us look closely at this word. Morale is the confidence, enthusiasm, and discipline of a person or group at a particular time. If you break a country's morale, the people will demand that their government surrender. But the bombing had the exact opposite effect. The British people showed an extraordinary stubbornness. Every morning after a raid, shopkeepers swept the broken glass from their sidewalks. Milkmen delivered bottles through the ruined streets. Prime Minister Winston Churchill used the radio to speak directly to the public, offering them nothing but blood, toil, tears, and sweat. His booming voice became a symbol of defiance. But words alone do not stop airplanes. The British survived because of a brilliant new technology. Listen for this word, radar. Radar uses invisible radio waves to detect objects far away. Because of a secret chain of radar stations along the coast, the British fighter pilots always knew exactly when and where the enemy was coming. Against all odds, the small Royal Air Force fought off the massive German Luftwaffe. Hitler was forced to cancel his plans to invade Britain. This was a crucial victory. But while Britain survived, it was exhausted. It desperately needed help. Across the Atlantic Ocean, the United States was watching the flames of Europe and Asia. Yet the American public fiercely resisted joining the fight. They practiced a political strategy called isolationism. Isolationism is a national policy of avoiding political or military involvement with other countries. The memory of the First World War was still highly painful. Americans wanted to fix their own economy, not die on foreign soil. But history rarely leaves a massive power in peace. Let us shift our focus to a quiet, sunny Sunday morning. It is December 7th, 1941. We are in the middle of the Pacific Ocean at the United States Naval Base of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Sailors are sleeping, writing letters home, or preparing for church. The great American ships are neatly parked in long rows. Remember the Japanese fleet that vanished into the fog? They had sailed thousands of miles in absolute radio silence. At 7:48 a.m., the sky suddenly filled with airplanes bearing the symbol of the rising sun. Torpedoes dropped into the shallow water, tearing into the sides of the giant American battleships. Armor-piercing bombs shattered the wooden decks. Within 2 hours, much of the U.S. Pacific Fleet was destroyed or severely damaged. Over 2,400 Americans lost their lives in a sudden storm of fire and water. The Japanese strategy was a massive gamble. They hoped that a sudden, devastating blow would shatter American morale and force the United States to negotiate a peace treaty. They wanted America to stay out of Asia entirely. Instead, they awakened a sleeping giant. The next day, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt addressed the nation. He spoke slowly and with absolute gravity. He called December 7th, "a date which will live in infamy." Pay attention to this powerful noun, infamy. Infamy means being famous for something deeply bad or evil. It is a dark, permanent stain on history. Isolationism vanished overnight. The United States instantly declared war on Japan. Days later, Hitler made the surprising decision to declare war on the United States, linking the two separate conflicts together. The localized wars of Europe and Asia had officially merged into one terrifying global inferno. The board is now set for the largest clash of industrial empires the world has ever seen. America begins building tanks and airplanes at a speed that defies all logic. But the most dangerous theater of the war is not in the Pacific, and it is not in the skies over London. While the world watches America enter the fight, Adolf Hitler turns his eyes toward the vast, freezing plains of his temporary ally, the Soviet Union. What happens when a dictator breaks his most important promise and marches 3 million soldiers into the brutal Russian winter? 3 million men stand at the edge of the world's largest country, staring into the summer mist. They are about to launch the biggest, bloodiest land invasion in human history, breaking a promise that will eventually cost tens of millions of lives. It is June 22nd, 1941. The sun has not yet risen. On the long border dividing German-held Poland and the Soviet Union, Russian guards are quietly drinking tea. They expect another peaceful morning. Suddenly, the earth violently shakes. The sky tears open with the screaming sound of massive artillery shells. Thousands of tanks crush the border fences, followed by endless lines of marching infantry. Adolf Hitler has ordered Operation Barbarossa. He has turned his incredible war machine against his own partner, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. For several days, Stalin sits in his office in absolute silence. He refuses to speak to his generals. He simply cannot believe the reality of this sudden action. Listen for this important English noun, betrayal. A betrayal is the act of breaking a deep trust or a formal promise to someone. Stalin and Hitler had signed a formal non-aggression treaty, promising never to attack each other. The betrayal was so sudden that it shattered Stalin's sense of reality. Why did Hitler take this massive risk? There are two primary reasons. First, he deeply hated the political system of communism. It was the ultimate enemy of his fascist ideology. Second, the German Empire was starving for raw materials. Hitler looked at the vast, endless plains of Ukraine and Russia and saw immense fields of grain to feed his people and deep wells of oil to fuel his tanks. He believed the Soviet system was completely weak. He famously told his commanders, "We have only to kick in the door and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." At first, he seemed absolutely correct. The German army, masters of the lightning war, destroyed entire Soviet armies in a matter of weeks. They took millions of prisoners. They raced hundreds of miles deep into Russian territory. The local citizens, caught behind the advancing lines, faced a brutal, unforgiving military occupation. Their food was stolen, and their villages were burned. But the Soviet Union is not a normal country. It is a geographic giant, stretching across 11 time zones. To slow down the invaders, Stalin ordered a desperate and highly destructive strategy. Notice this historical phrase, Scorched earth policy. Listen carefully to the words. Scorched earth. To scorch means to burn the surface of something severely. As the Soviet army retreated backward, they deliberately burned their own farms, blew up their own bridges, and destroyed their own power plants. They left the invading German army nothing but black ashes. They were willing to starve their own people to ensure the enemy had no shelter and no food. Think once again of our biological mirror. The invading virus has entered a massive host. It spreads quickly, feeling invincible, but the host is far too large. The virus overextends itself. Its supply lines stretch too thin. And then, the host's most powerful natural defense mechanism finally activates. In Russia, that defense mechanism is the extreme weather. By October, heavy autumn rains turned the unpaved dirt roads into oceans of thick, freezing mud. German tanks sank up to their engines. Trucks could not move. The lightning war stopped completely. Then came the snow. The winter of 1941 was one of the coldest in recorded Russian history. Temperatures dropped to 40 degrees below zero. German soldiers were still wearing their light summer uniforms. They wrapped their boots in stolen newspapers and rags to keep their toes from freezing off. The oil inside their tank engines literally froze solid. Their machine guns jammed with ice. Nature itself was fighting back. Despite the freezing death all around them, the German army pushed all the way to the outer suburbs of Moscow, the Soviet capital. German officers could actually see the colorful towers of the Kremlin through their field binoculars. But they could go no further. The exhausted soldiers were suddenly pushed back by fresh Soviet troops arriving from Siberia, men who were perfectly trained experts in winter survival. The war in the East became a grinding, frozen nightmare of attrition. But the ultimate clash, the moment the war truly shifted, happened the following year in an industrial city called Stalingrad. Imagine a thriving manufacturing center sitting on the edge of the wide Volga River. Over 6 months, it is bombed by airplanes until it is nothing but broken bricks, shattered glass, and twisted metal. But the Soviet soldiers refuse to surrender the ruins. They fight the Germans from room to room, from kitchen to basement, sometimes fighting with knives and shovels. A famous, terrifying order from Stalin declared simply, "Not one step back." Anyone who retreated would be shot by their own side. The Battle of Stalingrad is widely considered a massive historical turning point. Pay attention to this useful phrase, a turning point. It is the specific moment when a situation clearly changes direction. In the freezing rubble of Stalingrad, the German army was completely surrounded by a brilliant Soviet counterattack. The invaders were slowly starved, frozen, and eventually forced into surrendering. For the first time, the entire world saw that Hitler's armies were not invincible. The bleeding, deeply wounded Soviet Union had broken the back of the German military machine. We have seen how entire cities were destroyed in the fire of open combat. The myth of lightning victory was buried forever under the Russian snow. But as the tide of the fighting slowly turned in the east, a deeper, much more silent horror was unfolding entirely away from the battlefields. What terrible machinery was the fascist state secretly building in the dark forests of Europe? And how could modern, educated human beings organize something so unimaginably cruel? A heavy iron door slides shut. A loud whistle blows in the freezing winter air. Inside the wooden cargo train, hundreds of families hold tightly to their single suitcases, believing they are traveling to a new life on a faraway farm. They pack their warmest coats, their favorite cooking pots, and their family photographs. They do not know that their destination is not a farm, but a factory designed for death. To understand the deepest, darkest shadow of the 20th century, we must look at how an entire modern society was corrupted from the inside out. The horrors of the Second World War were not limited to soldiers freezing in the snow or cities burning from the sky. Behind the lines of the brutal military occupation in Europe, the fascist state was constructing a terrible, hidden machinery. This was the Holocaust. It did not start with camps. It started, years earlier, with words. As we saw in our first chapter, propaganda painted innocent neighbors as dangerous enemies. Then the words became laws. Jewish citizens were fired from their jobs. They were forbidden from sitting on public benches. They were forced to wear yellow stars on their clothing so they could be easily identified and avoided on the street. Listen for this essential historical noun: persecution. Persecution is the cruel and unfair treatment of a group of people over a long period of time, usually because of their race, religion, or political beliefs. The persecution in Europe was entirely legal under the fascist government. The state told its citizens that this cruelty was necessary for national health. When a human body develops an autoimmune disease, its own internal defense system becomes confused. Instead of attacking outside viruses, the white blood cells attack the body's own healthy organs. This is exactly what happened to the German state. The institutions that normally protect human life, the police, the courts, the medical doctors, were turned into weapons against their own people. By the early 1940s, as the war expanded across the globe, the fascist leaders decided that persecution was not enough. They moved to a deeply horrifying new phase. On January 20th, 1942, a meeting took place in a beautiful, elegant house near a lake in Berlin. This was the Wannsee Conference. 15 highly educated men gathered around a large wooden table. They were not uneducated criminals. They were lawyers, doctors, and government officials. They drank fine coffee and discussed the fate of millions of human beings as if they were discussing a simple math problem. At this table, they organized the final solution. They coordinated the train schedules, the camp capacities, and the chemical supplies needed to eliminate the entire Jewish population of Europe. Notice this important English term: bureaucracy. A bureaucracy is a complex system of government or business with many strict rules, paperwork, and official departments. We usually think of bureaucracy as boring, waiting in lines to get a passport or a driver's license. But the Holocaust was a nightmare of bureaucracy. It was the industrialization of murder. Office workers typed lists of names. Train conductors punched tickets. Engineers designed ovens. The horror was that ordinary people just did their small, assigned jobs, refusing to look at the terrible final result. This brings us to a process called deportation. Please remember this word. Deportation is the forced removal of people from their homes or their country. Millions of Jewish men, women, and children were forced out of their city neighborhoods called ghettos, and deported on those crowded, freezing trains to extermination camps in Eastern Europe. Places with names like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor became the graveyards of millions. We must now learn one of the heaviest words in the English language. Listen carefully to this core historical term: genocide. The word genocide was actually invented during this time to describe something the world had never seen before. It combines the ancient Greek word genos, meaning race or tribe, with the Latin ending side, meaning to kill. Genocide is the deliberate, organized, and systematic destruction of an entire racial, political, or cultural group. 6 million Jewish people were systematically murdered in this genocide. Millions of others were also targeted and killed by this ruthless machine, including Romani people, individuals with disabilities, Soviet prisoners of war, and political opponents. The scale of this loss is almost impossible for the human mind to comprehend. It is a permanent scar on the history of humanity, a loud warning about what happens when empathy completely fails. When the Allied armies eventually discovered these hidden camps years later, the soldiers simply wept. Even the toughest generals were entirely speechless. But as we look into this absolute darkness, we must also ask a vital question about human nature. When the state controls all the guns, all the radios, and all the trains, does everyone simply obey? The answer is no. Even in the deepest shadows of Europe and Asia, ordinary people secretly printed newspapers in their basements. Teenagers blew up train tracks in the middle of the night. Teachers hid children in secret rooms behind fake walls. How do everyday citizens organize a secret war against a massive, terrifying empire? And what extreme risks did they take to keep the tiny flame of freedom alive? A young woman rides a rusty bicycle down a quiet, dusty road in France. It is the spring of 1943. In her front basket, she carries fresh spring vegetables and a heavy loaf of baked bread. She approaches a strictly guarded military checkpoint. The soldiers look at her cold, tired face and wave her through. They do not know that baked deeply inside that loaf of bread is a hand-drawn map, showing the exact location of a secret German weapons train. She smiles politely, pedals past the guns, and delivers the map. That night, the train is blown up. Let us explore the incredible power of the human spirit. When a physical body is invaded by a deadly virus, the immune system does not just fight from the outside. The white blood cells activate deep inside the infected tissue, quietly destroying the disease from within. In the dark years of the Second World War, ordinary citizens became the white blood cells of a dying world. They lived under strict military occupation, completely surrounded by enemy forces, yet they chose to fight back. Listen for this important noun: resistance. In historical English, a resistance is a secret organization of everyday people, fighting against an occupying enemy army. The resistance in Europe and Asia was not made up of professional soldiers. They were school teachers, bakers, railway workers, and teenagers. Because they did not have massive tanks or bomber planes, they had to fight differently. They used a tactic called sabotage. Notice how we use this powerful word. Sabotage is the deliberate act of destroying or damaging enemy equipment to stop them from functioning. Resistance fighters cut telephone wires in the middle of the night. They poured sugar into the gas tanks of military trucks to ruin the engines. They quietly unscrewed the metal bolts on train tracks, sending enemy supply trains crashing into the forests. To survive in this deadly game of hide and seek, resistance members needed false identities. This brings us to another vital term: forged. If a document is forged, it is illegally copied or faked to look completely real. Secret networks of artists and writers sat in hidden basements, carefully creating forged identification cards, forged passports, and forged food tickets. These small pieces of fake paper saved tens of thousands of lives. We often think of the resistance taking place only in occupied countries like France or Poland. But historians note that some of the bravest resistance happened deep inside the fascist empire itself. In Germany, a small group of university students formed a secret organization called the White Rose. A courageous young woman named Sophie Scholl and her brother Hans bought a hand-cranked printing machine. They secretly printed thousands of leaflets, telling the German public the truth about the war and the horrors of the state. They mailed them to random addresses in the phone book. They left them in empty university hallways. They knew that if they were caught, the punishment was absolute. Eventually, they were discovered and executed by the fascist government. But their quiet, written words proved that even in the absolute center of a dictatorship, independent thought can never be fully erased. Now we must turn our eyes back to the massive continent of Asia. The resistance here was equally fierce. In the dense tropical jungles of the Philippines and Malaya, local farmers and escaped soldiers formed hidden armies. They lived in the deep mud, surviving on wild fruit and rainwater. Listen for this specific military term: guerrilla. The word comes from Spanish, meaning little war. Guerrilla fighters use surprise attacks, ambushes, and their deep knowledge of the local land to fight a much larger, traditional army. They strike quickly and then melt entirely back into the jungle shadows. These guerrilla networks constantly harassed the Japanese supply lines, making it impossibly difficult for the empire to control the lands they had conquered. The most important job of any resistance group, however, was not blowing up trains. It was simply watching. They counted the number of enemy soldiers. They measured the thickness of concrete walls. They noted the times when the tides rolled in on the beaches. Using secret, hidden radios, they tapped out this vital information in Morse code, sending it through the night sky to the Allied leaders in London and Washington. This brings us to a crucial turning point in our global story. The internal white blood cells were doing their job, weakening the enemy from the inside. But the body was still heavily infected. It desperately needed a massive external cure. The Soviet Union was slowly, bloodily, pushing the German army back across the freezing plains of the East. But Soviet leader Joseph Stalin angrily demanded that the United States and Britain open a second front in the West. He needed them to attack Europe directly to split the German army in half. The Allied leaders agreed. They began preparing for the most complicated and dangerous military operation in human history. They decided to cross the cold, violent waters of the English Channel and invade the coast of France. But how do you trick a highly intelligent enemy who knows exactly what you are planning to do. Evidence shows that the Allies built an entire fake army out of inflatable rubber tanks and wooden airplanes. They placed this fake army near the narrowest part of the English Channel, completely fooling the German spy airplanes flying high above. The enemy moved their best defenders to the wrong location. The true invasion force gathered secretly in the dark. Thousands of metal ships, carrying over 150,000 young men, waited for the storm clouds to clear. What happens when the steel doors of those boats finally drop open on the beaches of Normandy? And how many lives must be spent to buy back a single mile of freedom? It is the early morning of June 6, 1944. Rain lashes violently against the cold steel of 5,000 ships. Inside the dark boats, young men hold their rifles tightly, shaking from the freezing wind and absolute fear. The violent storm over the English Channel has finally paused. The largest naval invasion in human history is about to begin. We are at the beaches of Normandy in northern France. The Allied commanders have chosen 5 specific landing zones to break into the fascist empire. When the flat metal doors of the landing boats suddenly drop open, the soldiers do not step onto dry sand. They jump into deep, cold water, immediately facing a solid wall of flying metal. The German defenders wait inside thick concrete bunkers on the cliffs above, firing heavy machine guns downward. Notice this specific military adjective, amphibious. Listen to the word carefully. An amphibious attack is a military operation launched from the sea directly onto the land. Military historians agree that an amphibious assault is the most complex and dangerous maneuver in all of warfare. You have no cover. You cannot easily retreat. You must simply move forward through the water into the fire. The human cost on those sandy beaches was devastating. Medics crawled through the red surf, desperately trying to save their friends. But by the end of the day, through sheer, desperate courage, the Allies secured a foothold. The solid wall of the enemy empire finally had a crack in it. Within weeks, millions of soldiers and thousands of heavy tanks poured through that crack, pushing the German army backward. By August, Allied troops marched proudly through the streets of Paris. The citizens wept with pure joy, throwing fresh flowers at the passing tanks and kissing the tired soldiers. This introduces a bright, joyful English noun: liberation. Liberation is the powerful act of setting a person or a country completely free from imprisonment or foreign control. The liberation of Western Europe had begun, ending years of dark, brutal occupation. The European map was shrinking rapidly. Germany was now caught in a massive, crushing vice. From the west, the Americans, British, and French were advancing toward the German border. From the east, the massive, angry Soviet army was rolling forward like a tidal wave, seeking absolute revenge for the millions of lives they had lost in the snow. The grip was breaking. But a dying beast is often the most dangerous. In the winter of 1944, Hitler launched one final, desperate surprise attack in the snowy, freezing forests of Belgium. He created a huge dent in the American lines. This became known as the Battle of the Bulge. The Americans, trapped in the freezing weather without proper winter clothing, held their ground. The German army exhausted its last reserves of fuel, tanks, and men. they had nothing left. The fascist machine was completely broken. Now, let us turn our eyes across the globe. While Europe raced toward a violent conclusion, the Pacific Ocean was a completely different kind of nightmare. The Pacific is vast. You cannot simply march an army across thousands of miles of deep water. Instead, the United States Navy used a strategy known as island hopping. They did not attack every single Japanese base. They bypassed the most heavily defended islands and captured smaller, strategic pieces of rock, building temporary runways for their airplanes. With each captured island, the Allies gained massive momentum. Listen for this useful term: momentum. Momentum is the forward driving force of a moving object. Once a heavy object gains momentum, it becomes incredibly difficult to stop. The American military machine had gained unstoppable momentum, moving closer and closer to the main islands of Japan. But as they got closer, the fighting became much darker. On tropical volcanic islands with names like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the defending Japanese soldiers did not fight on the beaches. They dug thousands of miles of deep tunnels and secret caves into the solid stone. They suffered from extreme heat and a lack of fresh water, but they refused to yield. They believed deeply in a culture that viewed surrender as the ultimate disgrace. Here we must learn a complex concept: fanaticism. Fanaticism is an extreme, unquestioning belief in a cause, often leading a person to ignore reason and commit highly dangerous acts. Driven by fanaticism, Japanese pilots deliberately crashed their airplanes directly into American ships. These were the famous kamikaze attacks. Entire garrisons of soldiers fought until they were completely wiped out, refusing to raise a white flag. This brutal reality created a terrible equation for the Allied commanders. If a small, rocky island cost tens of thousands of lives to conquer, what would happen if they had to invade the massive mainland of Japan? How many millions of soldiers and civilians would die in a final, apocalyptic battle? The world was exhausted. The immune system of humanity was practically destroyed by 6 years of global suffering. As the Soviet and American armies finally raced to capture the ruined German capital of Berlin, ending the war in Europe, a small group of brilliant scientists is hiding in the remote deserts of New Mexico. They are quietly assembling a scientific terror that will change the universe forever. How does a war end when one side absolutely refuses to stop fighting? And what happens when mankind successfully unlocks the terrible power of the sun? A heavy silence hangs over the dark, empty desert of New Mexico. It is 5:29 in the morning on July 16th, 1945. Suddenly, a flash of light brighter than a dozen suns completely erases the shadows. Observers standing 10 miles away are temporarily blinded. A massive cloud of fire and radioactive dust violently pushes upward into the atmosphere, shaped like a giant mushroom. Mankind has successfully unlocked the fundamental building blocks of the universe, but they have used this ultimate knowledge to build a weapon of absolute destruction. To understand why this terrifying scientific leap happened, we must look at the final, desperate months of the Second World War. Let us briefly step back to the spring of 1945 in Europe. The fascist empire is finally collapsing. American and British forces have pushed deep into Western Germany. From the east, the Soviet army has surrounded Berlin, fighting a brutal, bloody battle from street to street. The architect of the terrible European occupation and the horrifying genocide hides deep underground in a concrete bunker. Realizing the war is completely lost, Adolf Hitler ends his own life. On May 8, 1945, the guns in Europe finally fall silent. The surviving citizens climb out of their ruined basements and weep. But the global fire is only half extinguished. Across the world, the Empire of Japan continues to fight with unbreakable fanaticism. The American military commanders stare at their maps of the Pacific. They must make a deeply terrible choice. They can launch a massive amphibious invasion of the Japanese home islands, but their mathematical calculations predict a disaster. Listen for this essential historical term: casualty. A casualty is a person who is killed, injured, or goes missing during a war. The generals estimate that invading Japan will result in over 1 million Allied casualties, along with the deaths of countless millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians. They desperately want to end the war without launching this final, apocalyptic invasion. This brings us back to the secret desert in America. For years, the United States government had run a deeply hidden program called the Manhattan Project. Over 100,000 scientists, engineers, and ordinary workers built secret cities in the middle of nowhere. Most of the workers did not even know what they were building. They were working on a theoretical concept, splitting a single atom to release an unimaginable amount of pure energy. When the desert test was successful, the new American president, Harry S. Truman, was handed a terrifying new tool. In late July, the Allied leaders issued a harsh warning to Japan, known as the Potsdam Declaration. This is an excellent moment to learn a strong English noun: ultimatum. An ultimatum is a final demand or a final set of conditions. If an ultimatum is rejected, it brings an immediate, severe punishment. The Allies demanded that Japan surrender immediately. If they refused, the ultimatum promised prompt and utter destruction. The Japanese government, deeply divided and proud, ignored the warning. On the morning of August 6, 1945, a single American bomber airplane named the Enola Gay flew high above the Japanese city of Hiroshima. It dropped one atomic bomb. The result was an instant, blinding nightmare. The center of the city was vaporized in a fraction of a second. A shockwave of invisible heat and crushing pressure destroyed thousands of buildings. Tens of thousands of men, women, and children died instantly. And many more would die later from a strange, invisible poison called radiation sickness. We must pause here to understand a heavy descriptive word: devastation. Devastation means great destruction or extreme damage across a wide area. The devastation of Hiroshima shocked the entire human race. A single airplane had delivered the destructive power of thousands of traditional bombers. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, creating another tragedy of unimaginable scale. Historians heavily debate these events today. Some firmly argue that dropping the atomic bombs was the only way to shock the Japanese leadership into surrendering, thereby saving millions of lives that would have been lost in a ground invasion. Others deeply argue that it was a tragic, unnecessary cruelty against civilians, and that Japan was already on the edge of collapse. History is rarely a simple story of black and white. It is heavily burdened with painful, gray choices. Faced with this absolute, godlike weapon, and simultaneously invaded by the Soviet Union in the north, the Japanese leadership finally broke. On August 15, 1945, the citizens of Japan gathered around their radios. For the first time in history, they heard the voice of their emperor. He announced that the war was over. Notice this crucial political phrase, unconditional surrender. Listen to the two words together. An unconditional surrender means giving up completely, without demanding any promises, rules, or limits from the winning side. The Empire of Japan accepted unconditional surrender. The deadliest conflict in the history of the human species, which had claimed roughly 60 million lives, was officially finished. The biological mirror is clear. The great infection of fascism had been burned out of the global system. The world was exhausted, heavily scarred, and bleeding. But as the smoke finally cleared over the ruined cities of Europe and Asia, a new shadow was already falling. The two massive superpowers that had worked together to defeat the dictators, the United States and the Soviet Union, now stared at each other with deep, growing suspicion. The map of the world was about to be drawn again. Nations would be forced to choose a side, joining a heavily armed ideological bloc. What happens when the weapons of war become so completely destructive that armies can no longer afford to fight each other directly? The ink on the final surrender documents is barely dry, but the world is not truly at peace. It is simply holding its breath, waiting to see exactly what will rise from the ashes. Let us step into a quiet, serious room in the ruined city of Nuremberg, Germany, in November 1945. Men who recently commanded millions of soldiers and ordered the deaths of entire populations now sit silently on wooden benches. They are wearing heavy headphones. They are listening to immediate, live translations of their own terrible crimes. For the first time in human history, the architects of an illegal military occupation and a systematic genocide are being held legally responsible by a united international community. Listen for this essential English noun: accountability. Accountability is the requirement to take responsibility for your actions and accept the consequences. In the past, kings and dictators who lost wars were simply exiled or killed in secret. The Nuremberg trials were completely different. They established a massive new legal precedent. Simply following the violent orders of your government is no longer an excuse for committing atrocities. A soldier's ultimate accountability is to humanity itself. While the trials punished the darkest parts of the past, half a world away, a different kind of gathering was attempting to build a safer future. In the sunny, optimistic city of San Francisco, delegates from 50 different nations met to create a new, global immune system. They signed a heavy document establishing the United Nations. Notice this valuable professional term, diplomacy. Diplomacy is the formal profession or skill of managing international relations, usually by representatives meeting face to face. The United Nations was built to ensure that future conflicts could be solved through calm diplomacy, rather than through the absolute devastation of war. But this bright, optimistic dream of global unity quickly fractured. The two surviving superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, had worked together to defeat fascism, but they possessed totally incompatible visions for the future of human society. The physical world was rapidly divided. This brings us to a highly important political word: bloc. Listen carefully. A bloc is a large group of countries that share a common political or economic interest and act firmly together. Europe was suddenly cut in half by an invisible line that Winston Churchill famously called the Iron Curtain. On one side was the Western Bloc, led by the United States, promoting capitalism and democratic elections. On the exact opposite side was the Eastern Bloc, led by the Soviet Union, promoting a strict, centralized communist state. Because direct war with atomic weapons would literally mean the end of human civilization, these two massive, heavily armed blocs fought their battles in the shadows. We call this long, terrifying period of global tension the Cold War. At the very same time, the old map of the world was dissolving. Britain, France, and other European nations had won the war, but their economies were completely shattered. They could no longer afford to maintain their massive overseas empires. This introduces our final major historical concept: decolonization. Decolonization is the powerful, deeply complicated, and often violent process by which a colony breaks away from an empire to become an independent nation. Across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, hundreds of millions of people finally demanded their freedom, completely redrawing the borders of the world and creating dozens of new, proud nations. We have now traveled a long, dark, and highly emotional road together. Let us briefly close our open loops. We watched how the slow, quiet poison of economic resentment and extreme propaganda infected a struggling society. We saw how the false, desperate comfort of appeasement allowed a dangerous, fascist empire to expand unchecked. We witnessed the terrifying speed of lightning war in Europe and the unimaginable brutality of military expansion in Asia. We stared into the absolute darkness of extreme prejudice, seeing what happens when a modern state builds an industrial machine for murder. But we also saw the incredible, stubborn resilience of the human spirit. From the tiny, brave wooden boats of Dunkirk to the secret printing presses of the underground resistance, ordinary people chose to fight back. We watched millions of young soldiers run straight into the fire on the beaches of Normandy, paying the ultimate price to buy back the world's freedom. History is never just a boring list of old dates and dead kings. It is a living mirror. It reflects human biology, human psychology, and the heavy consequences of human choices. The dangerous tools of the 1930s, false propaganda, the division of society into simple categories of us versus them, and a highly manipulated sense of victimhood, have not disappeared. They are always waiting in the shadows, looking for a society that is exhausted, afraid, and willing to trade its freedom for the illusion of order.